So nice of you guys to have me back. I speak to Republican groups all over the United States about a wide variety of issues, mostly related to free market economics. I try to help people understand the logic of how things work or how they don't work. You know, that if you raise minimum wage laws, you're not helping poor people, you're hurting poor people. That big corporations love government regulation of big corporations because they know how to handle it and it keeps their upstart competitors at bay. That if you hire people based on race and gender and not competence, that's not only grossly unfair, but if you keep doing it, you will end up inevitably with Kamala Harris. So I wanted this morning to answer a question, it was a good question, that somebody asked me a little while back, which is, why is it that Bernie Sanders is so popular? And he is. He is one of the most popular politicians in America. And this lady was very upset. She said, we don't have any tradition of socialism in this country. He's not even a Democrat, he's a socialist. How is it that he's so popular? And as I said, I thought it was a good question. And there is actually a secret to being a popular socialist. And Bernie Sanders has absolutely mastered it, which is that he's never been in charge of anything that mattered ever. And that's the secret. And the socialists have been doing this for a long time. I grew up in a very left-wing town, in a left-wing state, in a left-wing school district, and we used to learn about the great socialists of the past all day long. And they were all people who never did anything. Eugene Debs, who ran for president unsuccessfully, was an icon. We learned songs about him. There was a French socialist who was assassinated in 1914, right before World War I. And if you read modern day left-wing histories, they will tell you that if only this guy had lived, everything would have been great. World War I never would have happened, which is fascinating because World War I started because a Serb assassinated the Archduke of Austria. How this French guy was going to prevent that is beyond me. But it doesn't matter. He's safely dead. They can ascribe whatever they want to him, okay? And the same thing with Bernie Sanders. 100 years from now, they will be singing songs about Bernie Sanders. I absolutely guarantee it. On the other hand, you have actual socialists who've actually come to power, the Pol Pots, and the Stalins, and the Mao Zedongs, and the Fidel Castros, and that's a much stickier situation because they ended up killing millions and millions of people. So what I wanted to take this into the next logical step is why exactly socialism does not work for human beings. Another question, I get asked great questions. Another question somebody asked me, I seem to remember being interrupted with this question once, was, she said, are you saying that socialism can't work? And I said, no. I'm only saying that socialism can't work for human beings. And that's a really, really important distinction because the reasons that socialism can't work are specifically human reasons. If you're writing a science fiction novel about people who live on the planet Krypton, and you want to tell me that socialism works just great for them, maybe it does. It's your book. How can I argue? And nor do you have to go to outer space. I look at bees in a beehive. They look pretty socialist to me. I don't see one bee saying, I have been to more flowers, I've brought back more nectar than any other bee in this hive. Show me the honey. I don't think they do that. I think bees do what they're programmed to do. The workers do all the work, the drones do nothing, the queen gets pregnant, and nobody complains and nobody argues, and they just do that. The reasons that socialism does not work are specifically human reasons, and there are specifically 3 of them, and I can be even more specific than that. They all deal with the nature of the human mind. This is very important because you can't make historical arguments with socialists. If you say, here's the last 14 times we've gone down this road, and each time it turned into an absolute hell of people dying by the millions, they will say, yeah, but we changed the formula. We fixed it. That was the old formula. This time it's going to work just great because we got the formula right. So that argument will not win. You have to explain why it can't work. And that's what I was going to do today. And as I said, there's 3 reasons that relate to the human mind. And the first one is that we humans are greedy and lazy. And I've had people get mad at me and confront me in the parking lot and say, I am not greedy and lazy. And obviously humans are very complicated. We're lots of things. We're generous, we're industrious. But a certain amount of greed and a certain amount of laziness is part of the human makeup. And to say that that's not there is just ridiculous. Okay, it obviously is. What capitalism does, and it's part of the genius, if that's the right word, of capitalism, is take what's there in natural human form and turn it into something good. And I'm going to make a broader point here, which is that this is what functional human institutions do. We're human beings. We create institutions to do what? To take what is native in being human and turn it in a positive direction. So I'm going to give you a non-economic example of that, and it is this. In the world of humans, boys and girls tend to be attracted to each other. Okay? That's there. It exists. It's not going away. I strongly suspect they're trying to make it go away, but I think they will fail. I think 1,000 years from now, boys and girls will still be attracted to each other, okay? And out of this fact comes some good stuff and some bad stuff. I am sure I don't have to stand here and give you a list of all the good things that can come from boys and girls being attracted to each other and all the bad things that can come from from boys and girls being attracted to each other, because I'm sure you understand it as well as I do. The question is, how do we humans get more good out of that and less bad? And the way we do it is through an institution called marriage. What is the point of marriage? It's to turn this in a positive direction, so we get less bad stuff and more good stuff. And specifically in this case, to create a stable environment in which to raise children. That's what a good human institution does. So let's talk about capitalism. Capitalism is basically designed to turn greed into productivity. Let's say that I'm a greedy guy. I just want more stuff for me. I don't care about anybody else. I want to drive the fanciest car. I want to live in the biggest house. I just want more for me. Okay? How do I do it? Well, in a capitalistic system, I've got to produce. That's what capitalism says to me. It says, you want to have all that stuff? Produce. You've got to produce for others. And if I'm as greedy as that, a little bit of producing is not going to do it. I'm going to have to produce a lot. But there are ways in a capitalist model that you can achieve what you want. If you invent some new invention that makes everybody's life easier or better, you can make a lot of money and satisfy your greed. If you come up with a more efficient way to bring goods to market so everyone can get, the things they want cheaper and thus live a richer lifestyle, you will also live a richer lifestyle because you were the person who invented this. Heck, if you write, a best-selling novel or screenplay, same thing. But you've got to produce. What capitalism does is it sits you down and says, figure out how to satisfy your fellow human being. And that's how you're going to satisfy your greed. Okay? A good question would be, what happens to the same greedy person in a socialist society? Because socialist societies, and this is what I talked about last year, if you remember from last year, socialist societies are about force. They say that, oh, well, we're about giving free stuff to people. Yeah, what free stuff? Who decides what free stuff you're going to get? The leader, the boss decides what free stuff you're going to get. Where does he get it from? He gets it from force, okay? So the only system where you leave people alone is called capitalism. So what happens if you are a greedy guy and you live in North Korea? How do you get ahead of your fellow North Koreans? And the answer, and we could plug in any socialist dictatorship you want, the Soviet Union or communist China, it doesn't matter, same thing, is it doesn't matter what you do for your fellow citizen, it matters what you do for the leader. Okay, so Kim Jong-un runs North Korea, and if you can make him, like you, he can transform your life. The populace can't, as in capitalism, but he can't. He can give you this better life that you want. The question is, what does he want and what does he need? And I want to go quickly beyond the obvious yet wrong answers. Kim Jong-un has plenty of food and plenty of cars and plenty of girlfriends, okay? He's got all that stuff that he wants. What does he actually need? And the answer is, when you have a society that's based on force and socialism, for all the pretty pictures, it's all force, okay? If you can't force people, you don't have socialism, okay? He needs help in applying the force. Does that make sense? No one man can control 20 million people all by himself. What's he gonna do, point a gun at everybody? What happens when he has to go to sleep at night? Okay, he needs a bunch of helpers to help him apply force. And I want to be very straightforward here. He needs murderers and torturers and concentration camp guards, because that's how you keep your socialist society going. You've got enemies who have to be murdered. You've got dissidents who need to be tortured. You need to be able to lock people up in concentration camps. It is inevitable in all such societies. Most people don't want to be a murderer or a torturer or a concentration camp guard. But if you don't mind, and moreover, if you're good at it, you will rise through the ranks of North Korean society. Does that make sense? The better job you do of this, the higher you're going to get. A lot of times when one of these Kims, dies, the Western media says, well, maybe the new guy will be a big sweetheart who just wants to be nice to everybody. But that's not very likely, because the way you rise through the ranks in this kind of a society is by doing the dirty work for the guy who came before you. Okay? The chance that this is going to be a big sweetheart who's been in charge of murdering all the enemies of the regime is very unlikely. Okay, it's kind of a self-fulfilling thing. And I want to point out, I don't know if you guys ever think about stuff like this, but could we agree that Adolf Hitler, was kind of like a psychopath? Is that a fair statement? How about Stalin, who killed even more people than Hitler? He was a psychopath too. How about Pol Pot, who managed to murder about half his country's population in the space of, I think it was 2.5 years? Psychopath. Castro, psychopath. An obvious question to me arises, which is, how many psychopaths are there, and how come do they keep ending up running countries? Have you ever wondered about that? I think it's a really good question, not examined enough. And the answer to the first half is they're not that many. True psychopaths are actually pretty rare. Something like 1 person out of 1 million is an actual, genuine murderous psychopath. In the Western world, in the free world, they tend to ending up being a serial killer, okay? Which is not a nice thing to be. But I would be remiss if I did not point out to you that the worst serial killers in history killed a couple dozen people. Stalin killed 50 million. How much better it would have been had Stalin just been a free world serial killer than what he actually ended up being. So the next question is, how do they keep rising to the top? I mean, that's a real question. And the answer is, and I'm not suggesting that socialists intend for this, it doesn't matter what you intend, it matters what the institutions you create inevitably do. And socialism is an institution that causes psychopaths to rise to the top. Let's look at Stalin as a test case. When Lenin, who was the founder of the Soviet Union, died, he left a will to his fellow communists. And you know what he said in his will? He said, when I die, don't replace me with Stalin, because he's a psychopath. He didn't say that last part. When Lenin dies, who ends up replacing him? Stalin. Well, how did that happen? Lenin specifically said, not Stalin. And to understand that, let's imagine that you, at the time of Lenin's death, were a communist leader in the Soviet Union, and you might be, you're in the senior level, you might be the next leader. It's between you and Stalin. Stalin wants to be the next leader, you want to be the next leader. Who's going to win? And the answer is Stalin. And I'll tell you why. I am pretty certain that at some point you are going to have moral compunction. There's going to be something that you're not willing to do. Are you willing to murder people to get to power? Torture people, destroy whole families, whole communities, whole ethnic groups? At what point would you say, I don't want it that much? Okay, I am not willing to do these horrible things to be the next leader. Well, Stalin has no compunction at all. Why? Because he's a psychopath. That's pretty much the dictionary definition of a psychopath. Stalin will kill anybody, do anything to anybody he has to do to get the power that he wants. He is going to beat you because there is no limit once you're playing this power game. And again, I'm not suggesting that the socialist who lives next door to you intends for this. Again, it doesn't matter what he intends. What matters is how the system works. And once you have a system based on power, it's the unbridled use of power and the willingness to do that that will cause you to rise to the top. I don't think there's any more starker difference between the capitalist model and the socialist model than that, is what happens to the person who is ambitious and wants to get ahead. The second reason why socialism can't work, even on its own terms, is that we human beings can't predict the future. And yet we're fascinated by the future. Humans talk about the future all the time. Everyone has guesses. You can read endless articles in newspapers and magazines and the internet about people's predicting what the future is going to be, and nobody knows. There's nothing funnier than reading or watching science fiction from a couple generations back. You know, Captain Kirk's communicator in the 23rd century is not nearly as good as my cell phone is today. He didn't even get the internet on his communicator, okay? We never get it right. Nobody ever knows what this is going to be. But capitalism has a mechanism to get us to the future. And it is that everybody has their idea, and we all put out our ideas, and the people who get it right get rewarded. And the people who get it wrong get punished. And the result of that is we, step by step, in a stumbling way, make it to the future, because the ideas that work advance and the ideas that don't. Socialism has no mechanism for this at all. Now, if you ask your socialist friends, they will say, yeah, but the government will set up a department for new ideas, which is very cute. But new ideas don't come from the Department of New Ideas. You know where new ideas come from? They come from somebody doing things in a way that everybody else thinks is wrong, until it turns out that it works better. And then everyone stops doing it their way and starts doing it the way of the guy they thought was wrong. Okay? This happens all the time. When you eliminate that, because we don't know where it would come from, if you look at the Bill Gateses, the Andrew Carnegies of history, if you saw them as little children, you would never guess who was the one who was going to, the Henry Fords, who was the one who was going to have the idea that was going to change all of humanity and move us forward. Only by having everybody be free can you accomplish that. So this is the reason that what happens in socialism is paralysis. When at the end of the Obama administration, they were trying to open up relations with Cuba. There was a whole episode there where Cuba was on the news every night. And I was watching these pictures on my television of Cuba. It's a time machine. It's like Cuba is like going back to the 1950s. Okay, it's like Back to the Future. You know, no DeLorean necessary. Just go to Cuba. They're driving 1950s cars. They live in 1950s houses with 1950s appliances. They've got 1950s clothes and 1950s hairdos. Well, what happened in Cuba in the 1950s? The socialists showed up and everything stopped. And that's the second big problem that you have with socialism, is that you don't have a way to get this new idea that's going to bring you forward. And the third and final reason that socialism cannot work for human beings is the biggest of them all. And in fact, it's one of the biggest concepts in the entire field of economics. It is certainly the biggest concept in the field of economics that you could go to an American university and get a degree in economics, and no one would ever mention this. And it's simply this, that our economy, our modern economy, is very, very, very complicated. And our brains, our human brains, yours and mine, are very, very small. Sorry, just the way it is. It's impossible for any human brain to comprehend more than the tiniest, tiniest piece of what's going on around us economically. How can people control what they can't even comprehend? And I want to give you an example of this. The other day, I was in Walmart, and my wife wanted me to get a toaster oven, right? You know, you put them on your counter and you like reheat last night's pizza, you know, in the toaster oven. They have little rubber feet. And I got to Walmart and I saw a whole aisle full of toaster ovens, which is, by the way, a capitalist miracle that we underappreciate. The socialists always say, well, once we have socialism, we'll have all that good stuff. You'll still be able to go to Walmart and get all the stuff that you want. We'll just have socialism. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. You get rid of the system that creates the good stuff, you don't get to keep the good stuff. Okay, so I saw like 15 different brands and models of toaster ovens, and I found a perfectly reasonable one. I think it was like $35. I had been prepared to pay more, and I thought it was a very reasonable price, and I bought it, and I headed for home. And as I was going home, I started thinking about my toaster oven, and I said to myself, how many people worked on my toaster oven? My toaster oven represents the work product of how many individual people? I don't know, I guess I have economics on the brain. I thought about this the whole ride home, and by the time I was home, I had concluded that there were millions of people worked on my $35 toaster oven. Most of them had no idea that they were doing that because they didn't have to. Okay, and just to illustrate this, you know, my toaster oven starts out as an aluminum box. Okay, aluminum has to be mined when it's still in the ground. I think it's called bauxite, unless you think I don't do research. And so there's a company that goes and finds the bauxite and mines it out of the ground. Do you know how to do that? If I send you out into the world to find me a bauxite mine, would you know where to look? Would you even know when you found it? But this company, they're experts on it. Okay, this company's got thousands and thousands of employees, and they're not all the same. They're different experts on all these different facets of how to find the bauxite and how to get it out of the ground. Okay, and that's just the bauxite. It has to be refined into aluminum, which means you have to heat it to something like 1,500 degrees to separate it out and melt it. How do you heat something to 1,500 degrees without melting whatever it's in? I don't even know. But they know. There's another company that knows all about that. They've got experts, hundreds of them, thousands of them in the second company. And then all you've got is a lump of aluminum. You've got to make it into the sheets. You've got to poke the holes. You've got to get it, you know, so you can make my toaster oven. But that's just the aluminum. My toaster oven's got rubber feet. Rubber comes from rubber trees in Indonesia, and the rubber needs to be vulcanized. You know how to vulcanize rubber? Anybody? Okay. There's a company, thousands of people who know all about doing that, okay? This goes on and on. My toaster oven's got copper wiring. That's a whole different mine, a whole different refining process. My toaster oven has a glass door. I think they make glass out of sand. Don't ask me how, but apparently they do. There's another company, a whole other process, thousands of more individual personnel. This goes on and on and on. My toaster oven came with an instruction manual, which I don't even know why you need an instruction manual for a toaster oven. Mine has 3 languages. Trees had to be cut down, ink, printing, paper, pulp. This goes on and on. The truck that delivered my toaster oven had to be run on, I guess, diesel, which means oil wells in Saudi Arabia, maybe in Texas. The oil had to be refined. On and on it goes. Millions of people worked on my toaster oven. Virtually none of them knew they were doing that. The question is, who's running this show? Who's conducting this orchestra of these millions and millions of people who don't even understand the end product because they can't, because their brains aren't big enough to understand every possible thing that's going to happen with whatever it is they're producing? And the answer is our entire capitalist world is run by a little economic trick called the price mechanism. Prices, it turns out, are not just random bits of meaningless information. Prices are the secret to the world that we live in economically, because they do 2 things. One is they provide you with information. They tell you what your fellow human being needs and wants. They don't tell you why they need it or want it. Doesn't matter. They tell you this is what's needed, this is what's wanted. And second, they provide an incentive. If you deliver what's needed and wanted by your fellow human being, you get a reward for doing that. So let's go back to where we started this, which was the aluminum mine. If I own an aluminum mine, I don't know everything that people are going to do with my aluminum. Let's say there's a bunch of people trying to make toaster ovens, they don't have enough aluminum for it. I don't know about that. But you know what I do know? The price of aluminum. The guy running the aluminum mine, I guarantee, wakes up every morning and the first thing he looks at is the price of aluminum. He knows that as well as he knows his kids' names. He owns an aluminum mine. Okay? And so what happens if people are trying to make the toaster oven and there's not enough aluminum? The price goes up. And what's the aluminum guy going to say? He says, oh my gosh, this is the best price I've seen in ages. Let's make money. Let's hire more people. Let's run double shifts. Let's get that aluminum out of the ground and into the market. While the getting's good, my moment has arrived. And so he's solving the problem without even knowing that he's solving the problem. He doesn't know whether it should be toaster ovens or baseball bats. Doesn't matter. He's solving the problem because he got the information from the price mechanism. And you can see the same thing in reverse. What if he wakes up and the price is way down? What's he going to say then? He's going to say, well, this stinks. I didn't go into business to lose money. Let's shut down for a while. Let's lay off people. Let's slow our production. Maybe we'll invest in something else. Okay? Now, I know in modern America, we tend to think that anytime anybody goes out of business for any reason at all, that must be bad. But it's not. Capitalism is based on failure as much as it's based on success. One of the great flaws of socialism is that businesses that make no sense at all keep going because the government keeps propping them up. That's one of the things that makes you so poor in a socialist country, is that you keep subsidizing things that don't work and don't make sense. Whereas if there's too much aluminum, it's not good to put resources in getting more aluminum when you've already got too much aluminum, which is what the price mechanism is telling you. Okay, the people you lay off will find other jobs in things that actually are needed. We're reallocating the labor to what people actually want at this point. And at some point, they want more aluminum, then the resources will flow into this. This happens 1,000,000 billion times a second for every product, every commodity, everything you've ever heard of. And nobody can comprehend it. So how does this work? It works because we diversify our information around the entire populace, and every one of us understands our little world. As both a producer, you understand how to do your job, and as a consumer, you understand what you want and what you need and where you have to go to get it. And that works. What socialism does, no matter how benign the leaders might be, and as I've already explained, they're usually not benign, they're usually highly malignant, but even if they were benign, it requires somebody in charge to decide how much aluminum, how much copper, how many baseball bats, how many toaster ovens, what is the chance that they're going to get it right? And the answer is it's the craziest thing ever. How could they possibly get it right? Nobody can even understand what's going on here. And even if you would say to me, let's stretch credulity to the breaking point. Let's say the socialist leader happened to get the exact right formula. He's got a country with hundreds of millions of people. He figures out what everybody ought to get paid, how much of everything needs to be produced, where it all needs to go. You know what I'm going to tell you? He happens to get it perfect. You know how long that's good for? Like 1 second. 1 second later, things have changed. Have you ever watched financial markets on your computer? It's like bouncing up and down all the time. That's reality. Every second, the value of things is different slightly than it was a second ago. It bounces up and down because millions and millions and millions of individual people are making individual decisions. Socialists make 5-year plans. Okay? The reality changes second by second. It doesn't matter that you got it right because 1 second later you're wrong already. So the reason that people in the Soviet Union had to wait in line for a week to get a roll of toilet paper was not because their leaders were bad, even though they were. It was because you cannot run an efficient economy where all of this information has to go through a single person's head or a group of people's heads. Does that make sense? It's like we've got an economic information traffic jam. Imagine that every single road in America had to go through Noonan, Georgia. Okay, there's like one traffic light in the middle of town, and every single road in America goes through that. If you want to go from New York to Los Angeles, you must drive through Noonan, Georgia. What would happen? I think you would have the biggest traffic jam in the history of the world. Okay, people would be lined up from here to Florida because this traffic jam you created. That's essentially what socialism does. Because you start off with the idea that you've got to have this plan that applies to everybody, you end up with this intellectual traffic jam. And those 3 reasons are the 3 reasons that socialism can't work even on its own terms. Forgive me, I want to go back and tell you really quickly about why it works for the bees. Because you could, say to me, are bees greedy and lazy? They're not. They do what they're programmed to do. They're not sophisticated enough to be greedy and lazy. Can bees predict the future? Well, strangely, they actually can. Because if you're a bee, there is no difference between the future and the past. The whole concept of having a future that's different from the past is a uniquely human concept. No other species has that concept at all. If you're a bee, your great-great-great-grandchildren will live the exact same lives you did. They will fly to the flower and back to the hive, and there's nothing else going on. Okay? And finally, can bees comprehend the complexity of everything that's going on in their economic world? Of course they can. Because there's nothing going on in their economic world. They fly to the flower, they fly back to the hive. That's it. The whole idea of having this kind of division of labor that makes us as prosperous as we are is a uniquely human concept, which is why we need to look at these things in uniquely human terms. And one more point. Can we agree that our economy today is more complicated than it was, say, 200 years ago? If we went back to 1820, is our economy more complicated? I think we could say that our economy is more complicated today than it was in 1820. How about your brain? How much bigger is your brain than your great-great-great-grandparents' brain was in 1820? Sorry, not at all. Your brain is not even a tiny bit bigger, and yet the economy is incredibly more complicated. How about if we project this into the future? 200 years from now, in 2223, will the economy be more complicated than it is now? I'm betting it is. How about your great-great-great-grandchildren's brains? Same size. It's very important to understand this because socialism was a bad idea 200 years ago, but it's a worse idea today and will be an even worse idea if you project it into the future. Because as our economy gets more and more complicated, the ability of individual human brains to process it becomes more and more preposterous. And so there's my economic thought. I'm going to take my last minute here. I know some of you saw some of these last year, the books I write. My book, The Wizard of Is, which is about the Democratic Party with Bill Clinton as the wizard, Hillary as the Wicked Witch. There's also a cowardly rhino who suspects they're wrong, but he's too scared to do anything about it. It starts when Dorothy's house lands on Obama, and she finds herself in the land of the free lunchkins who've been living off the government for so long they've forgotten how to take care of themselves. The Gorax, which is a parody of the Lorax, is about how environmentalists are destroying our country for profit. Ironic and yet completely true. To think that I saw it on CNN Live, narrated by Jim Acosta, is about the media and Trump. It's the story of Trump, but it's about the pathological dishonesty of our media. Motley Click is about the whole critical race theory, identity politics world that we're living in. It's about this ship full of social justice warriors who, of course, hire for diversity. So they very carefully put together a crew with one of everybody. They've got a black guy, Jewish guy, Muslim, Asian, gay, Mexican woman, transgender, Indian, lesbian. And they're all out hunting for the great white racist. But they end up catching each other because they keep finding these flaws in each other's wokeness. Turns out none of them are quite so woke as they had made out to be. It's a very ironic story about how today's anti-racists are like the most racist people you're ever going to meet. If you were here last year, you might already have them, although I've got more if you like. But you are, honest to goodness, the first group I've been able to show this to, because these arrived at my house last week. My brand new book is called Camelot, with a K, and is the story of the Biden administration. I try to do different things each time. This is my first musical. It's written as a musical play, which is to say the various characters burst into song to tell you about themselves. So Nancy Pelosi sings a song called Speaker of the House, which is to the tune of Master of the House. And Hunter Biden sings a song, If Daddy Were a Big Shot, which is to the tune of If I Were a Rich Man, etc. Anyhow, if you're interested in my brand new book or some of the older ones, I've got them over here on the table and would be happy to share them with you. And thank you guys so much for your time.